Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be starting our unit on evolution. Now, those of you who have taken biology before have already learned quite a bit of this stuff, but given that we were remote last year, or it's been a few years since you've taken biology, we're going to spend some time reviewing evolution because much of this course is going to come back to these concepts of how animals are closely related to each other and how they evolved from common ancestors. Evolution is the unifying theory of biology because it helps us to explain and understand the diversity of life on the planet. In your own words, define diversity. Not only does evolution help us explain the diversity of life, but it also helps us to explain the unity of life. How even though we are so diverse from each other and from other animals and plants, we have a lot in common with every living thing on this planet, and it's evolution that helps us explain those similarities that we share. There are two big ideas of evolution. The first is that evolution is a change in the frequency of traits in a population over time. And frequency refers to the number of organisms that have a particular trait. For example, wings or feathers. And the second big idea is that organisms come from pre-existing organisms. For example, common ancestors. And so one example are birds. Um, Birds are the descendants of dinosaurs. And so we start off with a population of dinosaurs that have arms and very few feathers, if any at all. And then over time, the frequency of those traits become more common. So we end up with the development of wings and feathers. They become more and more common, and the wingless, featherless dinosaurs die out. You may have heard that evolution is just a theory. The thing is, a theory in science means something different than theory in your everyday language. When you're just speaking to someone and you say, I have a theory, what you really mean to say is you have a hypothesis. A theory in science has to be backed by a lot of evidence, and we have a lot of evidence in support of evolution. And we're going to talk about those different kinds of evidence. The first type of evidence is fossil evidence. We know evolution happened because there are species that are extinct. They're not around today. And we know that they existed because of their fossils that they left behind. So, for example, this is a fossil of Megatherium, which is a giant sloth. When you have the time, ask Mr. Romano about giant sloths. But in these fossils, we find a lot of similarities between extinct animals and living animals. And what the fossil evidence also shows is when these species existed. And by looking at where the fossils are found in the Earth's layers, we can sort of create a timeline of the evolution or the descent of extinct species and how they became the current living species. So the deeper we dig, the farther back in time we see. And fossils also show us the transition from extinct organisms to modern organisms. And one example is the whale. We see way back in time, deep within the layers of the earth, we find these fossils of a four-legged mammal that walked on land. And then we can see how that evolved um, and started to have some flippers, still had legs, but we can tell that this organism evolved from this one by looking at the similarities in the fossils. And then later on down the line, we can see even more changes. How the body becomes more streamlined and the legs get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then in the early modern whale, which is very closely related to the whales that are living today, we see tiny remnants of their ancestors. So modern whales still retain very small hind limbs. The next piece of evidence is homologous structures. These are parts of the body that are similar but might have different functions. So, for example, all of the forelimbs of vertebrates have the same patterns of bones. So, the human bones, we have the humerus in our arm, the radius and ulna, carpals or wrist bones, and our phalanges or finger bones. The same bones are present in the cat, in the whale, and bats, and then every other vertebrate creature that has limbs. The reason why these structures exist in these creatures is because they all came from the same common ancestor. It's just these different animals have adapted to different environments, and so the structures of the bones have been modified to help with those adaptations. So, for example, humans, we use our arms to grasp and hold things. That structure, that same structure, has been adapted in cats for walking, and whales for swimming, and bats for flying. We also have vestigial structures. These are organs or parts that seem to have no function, but the reason why they exist in the bodies of animals is because they were present in a distant relative. This is that modern whale skeleton with a small pelvis. The next and one of the strongest pieces of evidence that we have is in our DNA. When you compare the DNA of one species to another, the more closely related the two species are, the more similarities you're going to find in their DNA and also in their proteins. Because if you remember from biology, our DNA is the instructions for proteins. So if you have similar DNA, you're going to have similar proteins as well. So what this chart here shows is the different amino acid building blocks of proteins, and you can compare the different amino acids and count up how many are the same and how many are different in order to determine which species are more closely related to each other. The next piece of evidence is embryological development. Embryos of different species develop in almost identical ways. And the more closely related two species are, the more they retain similarities in their embryological development. So here we have a lizard and a tortoise, a pig and a human. So we have two reptiles and two mammals. So if we look at them early on, all of them look very similar, and that's because all of them are vertebrates and they all share a common ancestor that developed in similar ways. Now, lizards and tortoises are both reptiles, and if you look at the next stage of development, you can see that there's still a lot of similarities between them. You see the really big eye there, and the pig and the human are both mammals. You can see that there are quite a few similarities here too. And then even further down, we have the lizard and the tortoise. They still look very, very similar to each other, and even the pig and the human. You start to see more differences as they progress through development, but the more similarities they retain through development, the more closely related they are. And finally, we have evidence for evolution just from direct observation of species change. So, right now, there's a big problem with antibiotic resistant bacteria. We know through experiments in the lab that bacteria over time evolve resistance to antibiotics. So, if you take a population of some bacteria and add some antibiotics, some of the bacteria are going to die, or I should say most of them, but there are going to be a few that have traits that are favorable to an environment that's got a lot of antibiotics on it. And these ones survive and reproduce and create a new generation with lots of antibiotic resistant bacteria. So these traits become more frequent over time. And then we can also see how humans are able to change species through a process called artificial selection. So, this is how we ended up with all the different breeds of dogs. We chose traits that we desired favorable, and we bred dogs with those traits in order to make more dogs with those traits. And we do this all the time with pets, with livestock, with crops. So overall, there is a lot of evidence in support of the theory of evolution.